Hello chess friends and welcome to the Chess channel and welcome back to our Queen's Gambit Decline series. So in this series we're following this very nice opening from White's and from Black's perspective, and today we're continuing with our Queen's Gambit Decline series and the so-called Tarrasch Defense. The Tarrasch Defense we have explained so far in our intro video. Then we have started to analyze the so-called Prague variation of the Tarrasch Defense. Today we're analyzing a different variation. Today's variation will be the so-called classical or the normal variation, in which Black keeps, I think, a little bit more the tension in the center of the board. So this variation is maybe a little bit more dynamic than this Prague variation that we have analyzed before. The difference is that in the Prague variation, Black releases the pressure a little bit by playing c takes d4, but in this normal classical variation, Black doesn't take out the pawn immediately in the center of the board. Black keeps simply the tension in the center of the board. Black is hoping for more dynamic game. So today's game that I've prepared in the classical or normal variation of the Tarrasch Defense is really wild gameplay by the top engine Stockfish 14 against Houdini. Here Stockfish 14 will play with the black pieces, so it's now the last version of Stockfish that played now this Tarrasch Defense from Black's perspective, and you see now how dynamic this game really can become, because I think still the Tarrasch Defense is really a great opening for a dynamic player. I'm not a big fan of it because I like to play more positional chess. I like to play normal chess, but this Tarrasch Defense can become really a wild opening in an early stage of the game. So maybe for a more dynamic player, you can play this opening and hope for the best. So here, as I said, different variation, different line, and our second game that we'll analyze also is a brilliant gameplay by the former world champion and really the legend of the sport by Kasparov against Predrag Nikolic with the black pieces. So we'll have really the top engine game and also top human game here in the Tarrasch Defense in the classical system. So let's see now what is the difference between the classical variation and the Prague variation that we have analyzed before, and what are now the most important strategical and tactical ideas here for both sides. So here d4, of course, d5 is now the game that we're analyzing is, as I said, Houdini versus Stockfish 14. So here Stockfish 14 of course responds d5. We have c4, the Queen's Gambit, and after move e6 we have the Queen's Gambit declined, knight to f3, and now c5. Now comes the actual Tarrasch move. This is the Tarrasch move, which is of course searching for simplification in an early stage of the game, which of course hopes for an open center position in which the game becomes really wild. So here in the continuation we have c takes d5, e takes d5, and we have talked about these ideas that you are actually risking an isolated pawn situation here with move d takes c5. And please, in order to get a better understanding of this particular video, check out the intro video of the Tarrasch Defense and also our first two parts of this very important opening, because in that videos we have already explained some strategical and tactical ideas for both sides. So here from move e takes d5, and as I said, if you play d takes c5 in an early stage of the game, in my opinion it's not so good, because you're allowing your opponent to get an extra tempo with the bishop. Maybe in the near future you can do that, but you do that only when the bishop has already played here to e7, and then it loses another tempo by playing the move bishop to c5. So here with d takes c5 you're inviting your opponent bishop into the game. Now you can hope in a couple more moves that knight to c6 will happen, even d4. So although this is an isolated pawn, but this is not such a bad isolated pawn. Here in the continuation this pawn can be advanced, and of course in the near future Black can gain some extra spaces. So that's why White should not take out the pawn immediately in an early stage of the game. White should not take out the pawn on c5 immediately. White should delay a little bit this position in the center of the board. Then when maybe more pieces are developed, then it's time to strike with d takes c5 and leave Black with an isolated pawn. So here in the continuation after e takes d5, as said, g3 normal ideas. So see, in the Prague variation we have also analyzed this move g3, in which White continued then with bishop to g2 and knight to c3. But the difference between the Prague variation and the normal variation is that after knight to c6, bishop to g2, knight to f6, and here castling, castling, black doesn't take out here the pawn. In the Prague variation, this was the move c takes d4, and then after knight to d4, bishop to c5. So this was our analysis before. Before that, also white played the move knight to c3 here in this particular game, in the game between Houdini and Stockfish. Houdini delayed the move knight to c3, but will play it eventually. So it was maybe not the same opening line, but a little bit different move order, but we will reach basically the same position. So here in the continuation after castling, as said, bishop to e7. So this is now the difference. In the classical system, you play bishop to e7 instead of c takes d4. So the game is, I hope you realize, a little bit more dynamic, we can agree, because here in the continuation you see black keeps the tension in the center of the board. So still this can be an isolated pawn position, still maybe this can be pawn majority position, in which maybe black plays the move c4 and then has here a 3 versus 2 situation. Then white could have here maybe a pawn majority attack on the king side. So still many things can happen. So in the continuation of the game, here knight to c3, and after casting we have reached now the main position of the classical variation of the Tarrasch defense. White will most of the times play only 2 lines. The first line that we're analyzing is the move d takes c5, which will be really the classical variation, or here with the move bishop to g5, which would be the so-called Kasparov variation of the Tarrasch defense. So here in the continuation we're analyzing first the move d takes c5, and now the game becomes really dynamic. We can see that as I said in the beginning, white finally took the pawn on c5. Now black has an isolated pawn, but at least white didn't take out the pawn immediately. Black has already played once with the bishop. Now black has to play another time with the bishop in order to recapture the pawn. That's a huge difference when you play the opening stage. When you play, of course, openings, you want to of course play a fast development, and you want to restrict your opponents to play fast development. So that's why here black needs to play another tempo just in order to recapture one pawn. But now the game becomes really wild. Here Houdini, after move bishop to c5, challenges again Stockfish with the move bishop to g5, and down the knight here is of course pinned. The tension is around the square d5. Now in our isolated pawn style, you have to advance the pawn. We have talked about this strategical and tactical idea. So when we're playing here with an isolated pawn, here our strategy is for an isolated pawn. The themes for black are d5, d4 break. So we have to play the move d4. We have to advance the isolated pawn, and sometimes even sacrifice just in order to get a wild open center position. And here of course also you can create maybe some outposts on e4, but this is not an option anymore because now we have advanced the pawn. So now it's basically an isolated pawn position. Now with at least what we gain here is, I hope you realize, at least we have gained here a space advantage on the 4th rank. So here in the continuation we have knight to e4, we have bishop to e7, and here after bishop to f6 and bishop to f6, here Houdini and most of the times and also other players are hoping that they can create maybe a bad bishop position, because the bishop on f6 is a little bit blocked out by its own pawn. So we have now an isolated pawn and also a little bit of a bad bishop here position for black. But you should not worry so much, because we can say also a little bit that the knights are not so dynamic. This knight on f3 is a little bit out of game, so you would love to play of course somewhere with the knight and liberate your light square diagonal for the light square bishop. So this is not an option now. Immediately you have to search for different routes, for different paths for the knight. So far the knights are not so good. Of course they are controlling the center of the board, but you would love to fix them somewhere. You would love to attack something. In the near future we can also maybe expect a knight to c5 move, but this knight to c5 can always be challenged with bishop to e7. So although this bishop on f6 is maybe not the best of bishops now immediately, but in the long run it could be maybe a good piece. After potential d3 and then bishop takes b2, maybe this bishop can be very dangerous, but not immediately, because of course still you have to improve first your position. We can notice also that the bishop on c8 is not the best of bishops, because it has to be developed somewhere. When you do that, then you could also have maybe a b7 weakness. So let's see now what happens. So here b4, this line you'll see now many times it's a deflection idea. The knight gets deflected from the center of the board, and that's exactly what you should do. I think here from black's perspective, you have to take knight to b4, allow your opponent to do this, knight to f6, queen to f6. But now after knight to d4, mission accomplished, I think, for white. White finally liberated the long diagonal for the light square bishop, but at least we don't have this isolated pawn anymore. So I think it's a good compensation here for black. This is an equal game, but we can notice as again one thing what happened also in our semi-Tarrasch defense. If you have followed my YouTube channel so far, we have also analyzed the semi-Tarrasch. It's not the same like the Tarrasch. The semi-Tarrasch is a little bit different, and again we have reached a very important endgame position in which black has here a 2 versus 1 pawn majority on the queen side. So if you could just imagine this position from an endgame's perspective, without the rooks, without the queens, without the bishops, without the knights, without any piece on the board, maybe with only the kings and the pawns here on the board, I think black has a winning endgame, because black can create a distant pass pawn, which means now maybe black can create here a pass pawn on the b file, maybe on the a file, but that's not the point. Wherever it happens, white needs to go with the king towards the queen side and then stop this progress of this distant pass pawn, and meanwhile black will maybe sneak in here with the king and simply grab all of this pawn. So from an endgame's perspective, this is now a perfect pawn structure for black. So when maybe the game reaches the endgame stage, black is simply winning this endgame. So we have reached, as I said, similar ideas like in the semi-Tarrasch defense. So if you want to also study the semi-Tarrasch defense, you can check it out. We have also analyzed the semi-Tarrasch defense in our Queen's Gambit Decline series. So here after move knight to d4, it's not a bad position, I think, here for black. We have lost finally our isolated pawn, which was, I think, our weakness in the continuation of the game anyway. So now in the continuation here, Stockfish plays rook to d8, normal stuff, attacks the knight. Now I think you have to be familiar with this line. There are many games even in the database in this particular line. Most of the games are ending in a draw. There is a game here, Peter Prochazka against Josef Horvat, Bo Lindstrom, Gerhard Walter. So I'm just reading the games from the database. So it's now a counterattack with queen to a4. Here in the continuation we have a5. The problem is now with queen to d4, you don't gain anything, because here rook to d1 will happen. You have to here get out with your queen. If you play something like queen to b6, then we can play here immediately rook to d8, and then after queen to d8 finally we can get our piece back. And I think here black has a little bit of a positional problem, because now the b7 is a little bit weak. So here in the continuation of the game, if you play after move queen to d4, if you don't want to play after rook to d1, if you don't want to play queen to b6, there is now this move. At least you can play bishop to d7, a counterattack. But now after rook to d4 and bishop to a4, again black can get the piece back, and it's now again a slightly better position for white. So here after move queen to a4, that's why you have to play a5 here, like Stockfish did, supporting now the knight a little bit further. But now with move e3, white fixes also now the knight in the center of the board. Now after bishop to d7, the queen retreats to a3. Now knight to c6. Here again Stockfish is hoping for simplification. We have talked about this endgame strategy. As I said, when we trade off more pieces, when every piece is off the board, when every rook is off the board, when the queens are off the board, then of course black has the powerful endgame strategy here, this 2 versus 1 pawn majority, which could lead into a distant pass pawn endgame, which is really then a brilliant endgame position for black. I hope you realize what I'm trying to say. This is very important to realize why Stockfish is trying to simplify the game by playing knight to c6 and similar stuff. I think we can understand why this is happening, because here after rook to d1, here bishop to g4, very important move to a little bit also kick away this rook, or maybe even weaken the pawn structure, force your opponent to play the move after. Here bishop to c6 was played here by Houdini. Probably When it comes to computer evaluations, this is the suggested move, but I simply don't like it because after b takes c6, you have now weaknesses on light squares. Here the continuation of the game, rook to c1, rook to c8 was played here by Stockfish. Here rook to c2. If you play now queen to a5, it's not maybe the best of moves because we can play here simply rook to a8, and here if you try here queen to c7, then again here rook to c8 can be played, and now again we can try some ideas like bishop to h3, maybe then c5, kick with the knight, and then here queen to f3, maybe deliver checkmate. So this is now the tactical motif that bothers, I think, black always in the continuation of the game. So somehow to play the move c5, deflect the knight from the defense of the f3, and then attack simply the light square. So here in the continuation, this could be maybe a good position then for black. So after move rook to a8, here maybe you could try queen to c3, but again this bishop to h3 I think bothers you. Even if you place here something like rook to d1, again I hope you realize some of the tactical ideas can be also rook to d4, not immediately because e takes d4 will happen here. The bishop the queen is controlling, of course, here this is very important f3 square, but as a long-term tactic this could actually be the main issue here, something like rook to d4 and then sneaking in with the queen on f3. So also you have to, I think, move up this rook. So again I think with move c5 also similar position can happen. So these are really tricky ideas that bother black in the continuation of the game. So that's why rook to c2 was played now, and in the continuation here we have a bishop to h3. Anyway, we have a rook to c1 here by Houdini, rook to d5, and now here we have queen to b3. If you play knight to c6 immediately, it's not so good. You get simply rook to c6, rook to c6, queen to c6, rook takes, and now rook to d1. You see how important it is to protect also back rank. You have lost now the light square bishop here. That's the main issue. Even if you play rook to c6, the same position will happen. Will simply take up. Whatever you do, you cannot take so far the c6 pawn. So after move here rook to d5, in the continuation queen to b3 was played by Houdini. Now Houdini is protecting the d1 square. Now actually the c6 is weak, so that's why here in the continuation first g6 played by Stockfish. Stockfish at least creates some breathing spaces. Here rook to c6, rook takes c6, we have rook takes c6, and now queen to e5. And here again the threat is of course rook to d4 followed with queen to e1, delivering checkmate. So that's why here rook to c1 was played by Houdini. And okay, black lost the pawn, which is the main issue of course, but black has at least simplified the position further. Now still we can notice that our weaknesses here on g2, on f3. So again we could try some ideas of queen to e4 and then deliver checkmate. This can be prevented of course with move f3, but so far at least black is hoping for a dynamic game and for a kingside attack. So here in the continuation we have rook to d8, we have a rook to b1, and here a4 played by Stockfish, improving simply the position of the pawns. If you now take, of course, queen takes a4, it's not so good because we can simply try to sneak in with queen to e4. The rook is hanging, and then with rook takes d4 and queen to g2, this should be a winning position here for black. Pardon me. So here after move a4, we have now queen to b7, we have now queen to e8, and here after queen to f3, rook to b8, we have rook to a1, h5, simply improving the position further because sometimes we can get a little bit more challenge. We want to have also some spaces for our king. Here after move a3 we have queen to e7, knight to c6, now the fork, but not a problem. Here after move queen to b7 and rook to e1, because there is again the threat to play rook to queen to b1, and then you could again face this back rank checkmate. So that's why you have to play rook to e1 first. Here rook to c8, attacking the knight, and now after move knight to e5, queen to f3, here knight to f3 and rook to c3. Stockfish really paralyzed all of the pieces here of whites. After rook to a1, Stockfish won the game. I'm not going to analyze now the whole endgame because now we're moved 37 and the game lasted for more than 110 moves. So still 80 more moves have been played here in this particular endgame. It was a little bit more boring endgame, but the PGN will be actually in the description below, so you can use it, and you can maybe put the PGN maybe into some analysis. You can see then the whole endgame. The point is that here actually black is slightly better. Here Stockfish won the game. There is this a3 weakness, there is always this background weakness, so the pieces are paralyzed. In the continuation of the game, Stockfish simply used the king and marched towards the center of the board and won eventually the endgame. So as I said, the most important thing is to realize what are the most important strategical elements of this middle game stage. As we said in the continuation, the problem was this one. After move d takes c5, we have this continuation bishop to c5, then after bishop to g5, d4 has to be played. That's the only good move I think here for black. Knight to e4, bishop to e7, this was the continuation. Now after move b4, don't worry so much, knight takes b4 leads into this 2 versus 1 queenside pawn majority endgame, which could mean, of course, if the game becomes more and more simplified, that you could have actually a comfortable game. So let's see now a different example. As I said, Predrag Nikolic here against the former world champion Garry Kasparov. Here d4 d5, again queen's gambit declined. Now we have again the Tarrasch defense with the move c5, c takes d5, e takes d5, knight to f3. Again we reach this classical variation with the move bishop to e7. Here castling, and again this idea, d takes c5. Now we have bishop to c5, we have bishop to g5, again the similar position. Here we have d4, knight to e4, and now bishop to e7. Again here bishop to f6 was played, bishop to f6, again a little bit of a bad bishop strategy. The bishop is blocked out by its own pawn. We have rook to c1. Now here black get challenged here around the square c5. This is now the square that black wants to take, pardon me, that white wants to take. Here after move rook to e8, we have now knight to e1. Great move I think by Predrag Nikolic, because we can realize that when you face an isolated pawn, we have also talked about the main strategies, how to play against an isolated pawn. So teams for white here are blockading the isolated pawn and trading pieces for a favorable endgame. So now, as I said, when we watch now this pawn structure, actually white wants now to go into an endgame, because then of course black is continuing the game with an isolated pawn. But in this previous game, in which of course black gave up the isolated pawn on d4 but took the b4 pawn when white played the move b4, then it was a favorable endgame than for black. So now if white maybe trades off more pieces, if the rooks are off the board, if the knights are off the board, if the bishops are off the board, if the queens are off the board, then of course white has a dominant position, because then the isolated pawn becomes a huge endgame problem. Now from a middle game's perspective, okay, black has at least gained some spaces here in the center of the board. So here after move knight to e1, as we said, the main idea is to create a blockade, say play simply knight to d3, and then the knight is still controlling the center of the board. So here we have a bishop to e7. Now comes this idea, knight to d3, bishop to f8. Very important move I think here for Garry Kasparov. What Garry Kasparov is hoping also for here is maybe to play f5, then queen to e7, and then also maybe to attack the e2 weakness, because with the move d4 we have also created very important spaces. White would love of course to play the move e3 and then get rid of this isolated pawn finally, because you don't want to tolerate the space that black gained. But so far with the move rook to e8 and bishop to f8, black is controlling this e5 very well, so no e3 moves in the continuation for white for sure. So here after the move queen to d2 was played, we have now a5, knight from f to d1. Maybe also it was time for Nikolic maybe to play finally this move knight to c5, which could be I think very annoying to handle. You couldn't then kick away this knight with the move b6, because now finally the long diagonal for the light square bishop is liberated. So it's I think a slightly better continuation here for white. So here rook to d1 was played instead of that move. Here we have bishop to g4. We have now knight to c5, a little bit different, but at least white took control of the c5 square. In the continuation we have bishop to c5, rook to c5, and now queen to e7. We have now h3, which was now really one of the first mistakes that Nikolic played here, because now Garry Kasparov found a brilliant tactic, bishop to e2. You cannot take here queen to e2, because then queen to c5 will happen and you lose the rook, and if you take the queen, of course, then we can take out also the queen on the e file, and it's a much better continuation, of course, for black. So here after move bishop to e2, in the continuation we have rook to e1. Now e6, brilliant move by Kasparov. Here queen to c3, and now rook to d1, rook to d8, supporting finally this isolated pawn. It's now the best isolated pawn, I hope you realize, because it's supported by the bishop, it's supported by the rook. Now we can only hope that we can advance it here on d2. If that happens, then of course it's game over here for white. So in the continuation, knight to d2, knight to d4, here played by Kasparov. We have queen takes a5, h6, creating some breathing spaces, rook to c3, and now b6. We have queen to a6, and now queen to g5, finally attacking here this very weak knight. You have to protect it here. Nikolic took finally bishop rook to d3, but now even queen to d3, queen to g6, attacking the rook here on d3. The queen is pinned, and here it was game over for Nikolic. But Nikolic tried to battle here. He played simply bishop to f1. Now we have queen to d3. Very cool move also by Kasparov. He wants now to simplify the game, trading off the queens. We have this one, rook takes e8, rook takes e8, and now finally bishop to d3. And here I want to also to stop, because it's obviously a much better continuation here for black, and also Kasparov won this brilliant endgame. So the PGN will be also in the description below, so you can of course analyze then maybe this endgame for yourself at home. So okay, I hope you realize this most important ideas of the classical variation of the Tarrasch defense. As we said, in the continuation you can expect this move, d takes c5, followed with bishop to c5, then bishop to g5, battling for the d5 square. So you have to advance the pawn. That's, I think, the only good move. We have analyzed also some ideas of bishop to e6, but I think this is not good. At least when you play the move d4, you see this pawn is 3 times protected by the queen, by the bishop, and the knight. You have at least created some spaces. So maybe you don't like to play with an isolated pawn, but if you play the Tarrasch defense, you face probably many times this types of positions. So okay, I hope that you analyzed our analysis of our new variation of the Tarrasch defense. If you want to study the Tarrasch, here's the link of our whole playlist. You can maybe check out our previous analysis, in which I have also explained some different ideas for white and for black. And if you want to study our Queen's Gambit Decline series with some other openings like the semi Tarrasch defense, Chigorin defense, Queen's Gambit Declined, the Harvard's attack, and more, check out our Queen's Gambit Decline series from the beginning, in which we have also explained this openings. And if you like this content, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. See you soon with some more videos, and chess is the best, of course.